Hello, everyone. Welcome to Data Faces, the podcast that brings the human stories behind data, analytics, and AI to the forefront. I'm David Sweenor, founder of Penny Tech Guides, and your host for today's conversation. Today, I'm super excited to be joined with Shane Murray. He's field CTO at Monte Carlo Data. Shane's at the forefront of helping data teams build more reliable systems and drive trust in their data, which is everybody knows is the foundation of this current AI craze we're in. So we're going to talk about what it means to build AI-ready data products, how to think about trust with generative AI, and what governance looks like when the stakes are probably higher than ever. So let's get into it. Shane, welcome to the Data Faces podcast.
Thank you. Nice to be joining you today.
Great. So Shane, one part of one of the goals of this podcast is really just to hear a little bit about your background. I'd love to know how you got to where you are and what you're doing at Monte Carlo, and then we'll jump into the topic of the day.
Yeah, sounds good, David. So I grew up in Sydney, Australia. So pretty far from where I'm now. I live in Brooklyn, New York today, but I've been here about 15 years, the last 15 years. I was at a small startup in Sydney, a multivariate testing startup, one of the early ones in sort of 2005 to 2008, was acquired by Accenture, which brought me to the US. So went from a 30-person startup to a 250,000 person consulting company.
A few more people. That's just a few more.
Yeah, yeah, a little bit of a different setup there, a lot more structure. And then from there, I joined the New York Times. I was at the New York Times for almost 10 years, leading up their data organization. And so, I joined a team of about 10 in kind of a newly centralized data analytics team. And by the time I left, I was leading a group of about 160 across data platforms, so engineering and machine learning and data science, as well as data analysts embedded across the business, and established a data product function. So I was there from 2013 to 2021. And then for the last 3 years, I think it's 3 years now, I've been at Monte Carlo with the title Field CTO, which could mean any number of things. And for me, it's kind of allowed me to play a few different roles at Monte Carlo. I actually led a lot of our post-sales delivery. So the sort of customer success teams and the teams that work with customers to really roll out and operationalize data observability at scale. I was a customer myself prior, so I had experience rolling out Monte Carlo.
Okay.
And then more recently, I've actually switched into a kind of a product research and development role where I'm focused on how teams are building with generative AI and how Monte Carlo can support them in that journey.
Wow, that sounds like you have a wealth of experience. So I'm super excited to jump into this conversation. So, when we look across this landscape, Shane, there's no shortage of companies and promotional material and papers that say, hey, we have to be AI ready. Let's be AI ready. So I'd love to get your take on what the heck does it mean to be AI ready, and do people underestimate this challenge?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen the term now pretty much everywhere, and I feel like it's can be one of those kind of slippery terms, maybe a bit like data driven and data informed of the past,
Right.
where a lot of people said it and everyone kind of nods, but um, doesn't have a super clear definition, and probably people interpret it very differently. And I've definitely been asking, as I've been doing research across customers and non-customers, what it actually means for them. And I'd say it kind of comes down to a couple of things. For some teams, it is, who are very focused on internal analytics use cases and business intelligence. AI ready can mean actually getting your data ready for these kind of conversational BI initiatives, right?
Okay.
So whether that's Snowflake's Cortex Analyst or the AI BI solution in Databricks or one of many tools that are emerging in this space, data teams are thinking about, how do I move from supplying my data in a series of charts to actually allowing natural language to query the data from product managers and marketers and other business folk. And so that can mean high quality data as a starting point, which is something, Monte Carlo has and
Right.
continues to specialize in. I think we're the sort of leading tool for how you provide that high quality and reliable data. But it also means, how do you contextualize that data, with metadata and with maybe provenance, and so that the AI can actually query it reliably and understand the semantics of that data. So that's kind of one viewpoint I've heard a lot for teams that are thinking about what AI readiness means for them. I
Mhm.
think where I've been maybe more focused is, how are organizations getting ready to build AI applications on top of their data? And, that might start with, all right, I've previously been a supplier to the organization of reams of structured data. Now I have to sort of prepare and store my unstructured data with the same fidelity, maybe, right, and
Mhm.
accuracy. And so some teams are approaching it from preparing their structured data and sort of building clarity around how the organization is using that. I will say that the truth I've found is that that data doesn't really become ready until you start using it in AI. And so the
Okay.
teams that I see making the most progress are, deploying prototype and production AI products, learning where it breaks, learning where it's biased, learning, what's sufficient in terms of making this data reliable and ready for those applications.
Okay. That's really interesting to me. So, let's talk a little bit about data products. And you mentioned this evolution or change moving from structured data to unstructured data. And I think things are pretty straightforward with numbers. Like, we've been doing this a long time, and there's all sorts of statistics we can run on the data to understand, its quality and all of that. But when you get into unstructured data, text, video, audio, images, what have you, are there different set of metrics that people need to look at? And does the term data quality still apply, or is there something else that people need to think about? When people say data quality, my mind goes to numbers,
Yeah.
structured, but I don't think about text. So what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I guess I've always held the position that data quality is contextual to the use case. So I think it does come back to, like, what is required of this use case. I think it'll be very hard for teams to approach data quality of, all their knowledge bases and unstructured data without actually understanding the requirements of the use case. I often think about, and maybe just using the metaphor of structured data for a second, I often think about, financial use cases that have to be, you know, within a penny of the general ledger. So they have this
Right.
high degree of accuracy. And, when I was at the Times, it was daily. We were having to make sure that was within a penny of the general ledger for our operational uses of commerce and financial data. And then I think machine learning data in the past has often had, maybe fuzzier requirements on accuracy, but has needed to be, available,
Sure.
at sub-second latency and highly reliable. And then I think AI, these applications are requiring often a mix of high quality data and highly available data. Um, the way I've been thinking about the unstructured data concern is that at a high level, it's some of the same things we talk about with structured data in terms of the objectives. Like, it needs to be relevant, it needs to be complete, it needs to be fresh, right? It
Right.
needs
Yep.
it needs to be consistent. But then some of the definition of those is a little bit hairier to get to.
Hmm.
And many times what you're having to do is do some form of structuring of that unstructured data to actually get a metric you can look at. So maybe I'll give a couple of examples. One of them, which is very common in these AI applications, is you're building a RAG pipeline,
Yep.
and you're taking that unstructured data, which might be image or text, and producing vector embeddings from that, which
Okay.
are, mathematical embeddings of this high dimensional space that you can then look at distance metrics and start to understand things like what's the relationship between that context I've provided through unstructured data and the questions people are asking of the AI, or what's the distance between that context and the responses? Are they grounded in the context? And so there are a whole lot of metrics that can be applied, but it usually relies on this kind of interim step of semi-structuring some of that unstructured data.
Okay, I'm having flashbacks when I started my data science career. Out of college, and I did this fancy. Hey, we're going to do principal component analysis, right? And it's sort of almost like a vector embedding in my mind, in that you can't really interpret it. It's just a
Yeah.
principal component. It's a number, and the longtime engineers, they're like, I'm not going to use it. I don't trust it. I can't explain it. So PCA was done for my career there. But that's
Well,
interesting. I never
I
thought.
think, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, like, I think even putting aside the embeddings, there are some simpler things that I see teams doing, and you're able to do, including with tools like Monte Carlo, which is maybe take some of that unstructured data and look at topic occurrence across it, right? And you can use an LLM in all of these modern data warehouses to extract a topic, right, and understand how frequently that's used. And I think for a lot of teams who are for the first time using these unstructured data sources, even just getting an understanding of the topic distribution and prevalence is kind of this necessary profiling to know that their knowledge base is going to be up to date, even
Okay.
before you potentially do your principal components and your embeddings.
Sure. That makes a lot of sense to me. So let's just assume for the moment, companies we're pro governance and this and that. They all say that, but what where do teams what are the biggest challenges when we talk about trust and reliability of data? Are there some roadblocks that you commonly see across the customers and prospects you speak with?
Yeah, it's a good question. I've been talking to dozens of teams on this topic who are actively building, and I think the thing that gets most publicized is the hallucinations, right? The model hallucinates, and someone gets a car for $1, I think was one of
That's right.
the
Car
big
for a
ones.
dollar. Yep.
Or even there was an example just from a couple of weeks ago with Cursor, who's the AI code editor at the forefront of some of this, and they had a customer success chatbot go rogue because of a spate of cancellations, because it essentially told users that they could only use one device per subscription, and it just really made that up. But
Right.
these are the most publicized. But I think what's been interesting as I talk to more and more data teams that are building these applications, oftentimes that hallucination, is it, I don't know if I'd call it a scapegoat, but it's often masking issues that are affecting the effectiveness of the AI agent. And so, one of the most common examples I'd say is probably not an uncommon problem that you've heard about: garbage in, garbage out, right?
Sure.
Is the source data outdated? Is it incomplete? And I think back to our earlier question, a lot of these teams for the first time are looking at this unstructured knowledge-based data that's maybe existed in a lake or hasn't even been brought in the past, but now is necessary to build one of these applications, and finding that maybe their business logic or their help pages haven't been updated in 2 years,
Right.
right? And so that is very similar to the problems that we've gone through in structured data. You need to get that to a good enough quality where you can get reliable outputs. And if these models don't have a complete knowledge base, that's when they have a tendency to make things up. So I think that's one problem I've seen. There are some problems related to the embeddings that I talked about, people seeing kind of drift over
Mhm.
time. And so what was relevant yesterday may not be relevant tomorrow. Um, I think one of the interesting ones I keep coming across is this thing that I've kind of been calling small tweaks, big surprises,
Okay.
where maybe it's a prompt change or a change in the underlying model, whether it's Claude or Gemini or GPT, they do an upgrade of the model. This can have huge effects downstream on the effectiveness of their application.
Right.
And so I've talked to many teams that have almost had to go back to the drawing board and and rebuild their application or put it through alpha and beta testing because suddenly, and I think with the even with the recent version of ChatGPT, people are talking about how it's more likely to hallucinate, which may be a feature of it, but it means if you're building an application on top of it, that application is a little flaky based on these changes. And then I'll just say a couple more. Um, One is really just the complexity of this new ecosystem that you're putting on top of your data environment, which might
Right.
include vector databases and new orchestrators and API calls to these models. And the final thing is, how are people evaluating these models? And so I've seen from one end of the spectrum where a human is kind of checking every output, right, or
Right.
hundreds a day, right? And these are from large companies, but that is, I think human evaluation is necessary, but oftentimes it's the only thing, right? And if a human's required to check these outputs, then I'm not sure you can even call it AI at the end of the day.
Right.
Um, and on the other side, people sort of trying to figure out the right ways to automatically evaluate these things at a scale that allows them to roll out into production.
Okay. Yeah, I have a theory that, you can't, it's very difficult to auto, you can certainly apply automation, but I think, people are going to end up taking sort of a manufacturing approach. Like if you're manufacturing pharmaceuticals, you can't inspect every pill. So what you do, you have a quality control process and you sample it. And I think that will probably be maybe an emerging, model moving forward. But you mentioned AI agents, so I'm very curious about this. And you mentioned hallucinations or confabulations. These things just totally bunk them and make crap up all the time. What could possibly go wrong, Shane, when we have an agent and what do we call it? The butterfly effect or cascading effect, where one small perturbation in the beginning screws up the whole downstream system. Like what how do companies wrestle with this? And have you seen this?
Yeah, I mean, I think the era of these new agents is kind of emerging, and so people
Hmm.
are treading fairly cautiously with these multi-agentic frameworks and how they approach them. But I think you're right. Like, uh, the errors essentially can compound across these systems.
Right.
And so I do see like human in the loop as the predominant way teams are actually making use of these things. I also think you're seeing a shift from maybe the the AI chatbot era of 2024, which was all right, let's build a chatbot and let's, internal or external use case, which is obviously valid, but I also think you're seeing this shift towards more collaborative systems that have people checking in multiple steps. And I do think
Right.
that's the most viable approach because these things don't always have, I don't think you can rely on them to have common sense. I think you need to have constraints and a tight feedback loop in these systems.
Yeah, one thing that's really interesting me. So if we go back to, whatever term you want to use, predictive analytics is my old term, or predictive AI, I think is the new buzzword. But um, the interesting thing to me is if you were to develop a predictive model to do whatever, you could sort of control everything if you wanted. Like you had complete control over your data estate in most cases, and you could build the models fairly straightforward. With generative AI, you're sort of going to use some sort of foundation model. It's pre-built for you. You know what's in it. The world is in this thing. So how do how do organizations, how are they rethinking, data or AI governance for this AI world? Because you don't control what's in this, seemingly black box. And I know we're trying to put guardrails, in it and on both sides of it. But how are people rethinking this?
Yeah, I mean, I think that shift from at least most of what data teams did was these deterministic, um, value chains of data that you really
Mhm.
just had to make more reliable and more accurate, but they were repeatable.
Sure.
And then machine learning was probabilistic, and I'm not even sure you'd call these systems probabilistic. It's part of it, but they're they've got a bunch of other elements that are unpredictable to data teams.
Right.
Um, the I mean, the interesting thing is I think what it's doing to data meets software engineering, and in a number of teams I've talked to, it's not a given that the data team is in the room, which is potentially a problem for
Okay.
some of these applications.
Okay.
I think at one end of the spectrum, you have sort of CTOs saying, all right, we've got to use generative AI across the board. Everyone starts building applications. And then the data team, if they're not positioned right in the company, may struggle to actually have a say in these conversations. When I talk to the teams that are kind of leading the charge on how they're rethinking this idea of data governance or standards in this AI world, I probably think of a few categories. One is, some teams I've talked to, the data team owns the use case end to end. And
Okay.
often that's something like, document processing, right? That was maybe a very human-driven approach that they've brought kind of process automation through LLMs to.
Mhm.
And but often internal solutions where they own the end-to-end and they control the quality of the data. They ensure they're getting the most reliable data from their platform to feed into these. And they also ensure they have quality controls on the output.
Right.
I think then I'm seeing another branch of teams where data is kind of supporting use cases out in software or product teams. That might be personalization or discovery use cases. And so the data team's not leading, but they're often bringing their knowledge and expertise to those teams about which data streams to use that are most reliable and about how to evaluate the output to ensure that it's meeting the right precision and recall or the right accuracy of the solution. And then there's probably a third group of kind of forward thinking leaders that are like, all right, we're building applications in a decentralized way. How do I bring a foundation and a platform? And often it was the data platform lead or the machine learning platform lead saying, we are now the data and AI platform team.
Right.
How do I bring privacy, security, observability, maybe experimentation infrastructure to the way these things are rolled out and ensure there's some standards to how we do this? And so I think that's where we're headed and where the leading teams are going. They're thinking about platform standards, but if you talk to them, they're also, you know, making sure that they are not seen as the person pumping the brakes in the company, right?
Right.
They're having to demonstrate the same speed as the organization in order to get these things live, but also then bring the standards to make sure they have high quality inputs and high quality outputs.
Okay. That's quite interesting. Maybe I want to talk a little bit about trust. And I could just use this analogy. It's probably the wrong one, but like if you look at self-driving cars, yes, they've been in a few accidents, and that's horrible, and that's bad. It's not good. But people get in accidents all the time. We don't sort of question that. It's like, ah, well, you're driving, it may happen, and that's also bad. So when we talk about AI trust, do we have the wrong like mental model of this? Do we, we tend to anthropomorphize, these
Yeah.
AI and these systems. So I'm trying to what does trust mean in this context? I mean, do we trust our employees, I guess? And are they more or less accurate than these models? I'm curious what your perspective on this whole concept of trust with these mathematical systems.
Yeah. Uh, I think trust in employees can be a variable concept too, but
Right.
I think it's I think it's interesting because what I'm seeing, and I'm even seeing this at Monte Carlo, success in building these agents is sometimes treating them like a team of people, getting specialists for different tasks, orchestrating and managing that team. Um, an example, we built what's called the troubleshooting agent at Monte Carlo to
Okay.
reduce the time to resolve an incident. And it's effectively a main agent who spawns or brings together a set of topic agents that go and explore hypotheses in parallel, right, on what could have caused a data incident, and then come back and report back to their leader. So it is
Okay.
a kind of a human design concept. But I think to the question of whether we can trust them as humans, I'd say not implicitly. I think we generally try to trust and empower people when we bring together a team,
Right.
and I don't think we're applying the same to these LLMs or AI. It'd almost be equivalent to someone who didn't have common sense, and so you need to establish very clear objectives, tight constraints, and a really tight feedback loop to make sure they don't go off in the wrong direction,
I
right?
think I
So
know a
it's
few
a
of these people.
um, and I heard Jan LeCun from Meta, talking about this, and it is. He was kind of thinking about it as these don't really have common sense to go and you know develop knowledge on their own, and so you have to almost have machines checking the machines, and then status being reported back to the humans is probably where we're headed. Um, I think
Okay.
if there's a question about can we ever trust them, I think definitely on tasks that are kind of well trodden by humans and don't require novel
Right.
thinking.
Right.
But aside from that, I'd say no. Tight leash.
Yeah, I like that. That's pretty sage advice. And I wrote this blog like last year on AI sycophancy. AI essentially tells you what you want to hear. And I just saw
Oh
Sam
yeah.
Altman yesterday said it glazes too much. So I guess I used the wrong term and it didn't get a headline there. But
Glazes. That's a nice
yeah,
euphemism for for it.
yeah,
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting. But I had read this paper, and I have to dig up the source. But conventional wisdom says when we use RAG implementation, it reduces hallucinations. In this paper I saw, and I got to read the whole thing, it says that might not be true. Have you come across this, and what are the implications if that is true?
If it's true that it reduces hallucinations, or
No,
if it doesn't.
it does not. That's what the paper
Oh,
the paper said, because everybody's like, oh yeah, if you have the RAG, it reduces hallucinations. And I've seen, I put in documentation, for products I've worked on, and it starts making up stuff. And I think what's going on, it just
yeah,
exceeds the context window. But you
yeah,
give me the page number and the quote and whatever, but it doesn't tell you it's exceeded. They're getting better at that. But when I tried it a while ago, it didn't tell you it exceeded the context window. It just starts making up crap. And I'm like, I know
yeah,
this is wrong. You have the
yeah.
documentation. Why is it wrong? So I'm curious your thoughts on what would be the implications of that.
Yeah, well, and I definitely don't think RAG is a fail-safe for hallucination. I think it brings relevant context from your proprietary data, and but it doesn't necessarily prevent this idea that the model will get outside of that knowledge base and start making things up. Um, I think, where teams are headed is that it's very easy to get a prototype out the door, but actually getting it into production means that you have to iterate and deal with these problems like hallucination and bring observability across both the inputs, the entire value chain, and the outputs,
Okay.
in order to manage this and iterate over time. And I think it's this kind of shift um, where people, a lot of the work in software development used to be, leading up to launch, and now it's quite easy to launch, but post-launch you actually have this problem of maintaining something that's reliable and trustworthy in production. I think that's where a lot of the effort is going to be
Oh
focused.
yeah, probably more work, and I feel like another flashback to everybody's like, hey, I built this predictive model with Python on my laptop. Great, not going to work. Not going to work for your enterprise system. I think you need a little more there. So let's we're getting towards the end of time here. So let's talk about let's prognosticate for the future. So what sort of frameworks or tech do you think will really define the future of trustworthy AI and data products?
Hmm. Um, Yeah, so I think trust can. We haven't really discussed it much today, but I think trust can also a pivotal component is going to be, this idea of responsible AI, ensuring these
Mhm.
are fair and unbiased. And I think with legislation, that's going to mean many teams have to build in explainability and auditability of these systems, which is
Sure.
quite challenging today. So I think there's like a huge field of research and development into, how do you trace all the responses in a multi-agent system and be able to understand what's going on. um, I think as I've kind of talked about, the data observability space is evolved into the data and AI observability space. And I think there's, a huge requirement on managing all these structured and unstructured inputs to the models, the complexity of the system, and then I've been certainly um, seeing a lot of growth and development in this. How do you evaluate effectively and efficiently the model output, right? How do
Right.
you ensure that it's grounded, it's relevant, and are you doing that with human evaluation, machine evaluation, or these LLM as a judge type things? And so I think those are the big spaces that are a focus area. I think the maybe unifying thought is that I don't think trust can be siloed across that. It is this system that you need to ensure trust across every piece. And I
Right.
think it's if you're looking at it in a silo, you're going to run into some problems. And I think, historically teams have said, well, can I just solve this in dev and then let it go in prod? And as I kind of alluded to, like a lot of the work for teams that are building these is in prod, and monitoring and observing these systems in prod is going to be essential.
Okay. So I think I'm hearing a lot of maybe changes probably to traditional IT infrastructure architecture, kind of moving from data governance to AI governance, which is, maybe a superset of it. I'm hearing there's going to be more need for sort of post rollout monitoring and tweaking and whatever words we want to use for that. I think vectors and embeddings and all those things are new. Data observability, quite new for probably a lot of IT teams. The kind you're talking about. It's the whole system. It's not just the ETL job. We've been doing
Yeah,
that for a long time, but the whole end-to-end system with all these agents, I think, definitely an evolving space. So, maybe just to wrap up, Shane, what sort of words of wisdom or advice could you impart to our listeners who are like, I don't know where to start. How do I get going? And and also let me know how they can get a hold of you if they have more questions on Monte Carlo or any questions for you.
sure. Yeah, I mean, I think, and um, the the sort of advice I'd give is what I've seen both at Monte Carlo and outside of Monte Carlo is you'll learn more in a couple of weeks of building than, months of planning and prognosticating. And so the teams that are doing, research, not just development, but doing some research and getting POCs up and running are learning about what trustworthy and reliable really means, and having those conversations with their executive leadership about what it takes to actually get this thing into production. And so I wouldn't sit behind AI readiness. I'd as a thing, I'd actually start building, and even if it doesn't have to be a chatbot. It could be summarizing call transcripts, or it could be
Sure.
taking some document processing, structuring the unstructured data. A lot of teams are doing interesting work in that space. And then I'd say, keep humans in the loop. This doesn't have to be an all intelligent robot. This can be something where you move from human driven task to human reviewed task. And I think all of the successful teams I'm seeing are doing that. And finally, they're also focusing on problems that have meaningful long-term impact. So that's where they're finding value. You kind of alluded to it with machine learning or predictive analytics projects. You can't just build something and throw it over the fence. You need
Right.
to actually think of these as something that's going to be long-lived. So you should focus on picking some problems that are useful over a span of months or years as opposed to weeks.
I love that. Focus on your core and what matters. So, Shane, this has been a very fascinating conversation. So I appreciate you joining the Data Faces podcast. How do people get a hold of you if they have questions?
Sure. I think you can find me on LinkedIn. I actually I don't know what my handle is, but it's Shane Murray at Monte Carlo. And my email, if people wanted to email me, is smurray, Murray, at montecarlodata.com.
Awesome. Well, I appreciate it, Shane. Thanks for joining the podcast, and I'll see you out there.
Thanks so much, David. This is great.
Cheers. Bye.